Ounce for ounce, the ink sitting inside a standard HP printer cartridge can cost more than a bottle of Dom Pérignon champagne. That's not a throwaway exaggeration. Consumer testing has put the real price of HP ink anywhere from $13 to $95 an ounce. A UK consumer group ran the comparison directly and found some official ink cartridges running at more than 7 times the price of vintage champagne, milliliter for milliliter. The ink itself, the raw liquid, is estimated to cost the company somewhere around $2 to actually produce. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a company would rather reach into a printer you already paid for and quietly disable it than let you save a few dollars on ink. That's not a metaphor for corporate greed. It's a real decision HP made, on purpose, that eventually got the company sued on 2 continents. None of this is an accident, and none of it is really about ink. It's a business model that's over a century old, and HP's own CEO has said the quiet part out loud, in public, on stage. Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2024, Enrique Lores described the strategy in almost exactly these words. The company loses money on the hardware and makes its money on the supplies. Sell the printer cheap, sometimes at an actual loss because the printer isn't the product. The printer is the doorway to years of cartridges. It's the same model razor companies figured out generations ago. Give away the handle, sell the blades forever, an idea usually credited to King Camp Gillette, who priced the razor handle low specifically to build a permanent customer base for the blades that actually made the company money. Here's where HP took that century-old idea, somewhere razors never went, somewhere that eventually landed the company in federal court. In September 2016, the company pushed out a firmware update to millions of inkjet printers worldwide, marketed as a routine security patch. What it actually did was quietly reprogram those printers to detect and reject ink cartridges that weren't made by HP, including cartridges customers had already bought and paid for before the update ever arrived. Printers that worked perfectly the day before suddenly displayed error messages claiming the cartridge was damaged or missing. Customers who hadn't touched their printer settings in months found themselves staring at a machine that, overnight, simply stopped working with ink they already owned. HP later admitted those error messages were simply false. The ink was fine. The printer had just been told remotely to stop accepting it. When lawyers described that kind of firmware in court, they didn't reach for gentle language. Software that installs itself without meaningful consent and disables hardware functionality you already own and paid for is, by most technical definitions, functioning exactly like malware. HP called it a security feature. It named the program Dynamic Security, and versions of it have shipped on most HP printers made since, quietly running in the background of a machine most people assume just prints documents. The legal consequences piled up and stayed strikingly small next to the profits involved. HP settled a lawsuit over the 2016 bricking incident for $1.5 million, with individual claimants receiving payouts as small as a few $1,000s each. In 2021, it paid out another $1.5 million in a separate settlement, this one over printers that falsely reported cartridges as empty while there was still usable ink inside, nudging customers to buy replacements early. A few $1,000,000 spread across nearly a decade is a rounding error against an ink and toner business that generates billions of dollars in profit every single year from a printer division that barely breaks even on the hardware itself. The most recent settlement, finalized in 2025, gave owners of just 21 specific HP printer models the ability to formally decline dynamic security updates or roll them back if already installed. Every other HP printer released after December 2016, which is to say most of them, remains fully open to a future firmware update changing what ink it will and won't accept, with no opt-out at all. HP still frames dynamic security purely as protection against counterfeit cartridges and printer damage, a position it has repeated in nearly every public statement on the issue since 2016. Critics call it exactly what the courts have called it: a lock dressed up as a safety feature over a decision that should belong to the person who bought the printer. It's worth asking whether this is just how the entire industry behaves, and the answer is genuinely mixed. which makes HP's choice to keep going look less like an industry norm and more like a deliberate bet. Keurig built a nearly identical lockout into its Keurig 2.0 coffee machine in 2014, using a scanner that only recognized Keurig licensed pods, rolled out right after the original K-Cup patent had expired, and competitors started selling cheaper alternatives. It backfired almost immediately. Sales dropped by roughly a quarter within months. The company's stock fell alongside it. Hackers defeated the entire scanning system with little more than a piece of tape wrapped around a used pod, and Keurig reversed the policy within about a year, publicly admitting it had badly misjudged how customers would react. HP took the opposite bet, held its ground for nearly a decade, and so far the math has worked out in its favor. None of it stayed contained to the United States. As of 2026, consolidated HP printer cases are moving through federal court in Northern California, with separate legal action proceeding in the European Union as well. Plaintiffs argue HP never adequately disclosed at the moment of purchase that a future update could quietly restrict what ink the printer would accept. Courts have spent much of the year specifically deciding whether millions of affected printer owners share enough in common to be treated as a single class action, rather than having to fight the company individually, a procedural question that will decide whether this ever amounts to more than another handful of small scattered settlements. Zoom out, and the scale is enormous, far bigger than one company's court dates. Research groups estimate American consumers alone waste something like $10 billion a year buying name brand ink, at markups they could largely avoid with refillable or third-party alternatives that, in independent lab testing, usually perform just as well as the original. That estimate doesn't even count the people who bought a legitimate third-party cartridge and then lost it anyway, the moment their printer decided, overnight, that it no longer recognized it. Regulators are finally starting to respond. The European Union has proposed right-to-repair rules that would require printer manufacturers to allow genuine third-party ink compatibility, rather than letting firmware quietly decide the matter on the manufacturer's behalf. Similar proposals are being discussed in Canada, Australia, and a handful of individual U.S. states, though none has passed into binding law yet. None of this means printers themselves are some uniquely evil piece of technology. Selling a product cheap and profiting on what keeps it running is a legitimate, ordinary business strategy used everywhere from coffee machines to game consoles to razors sitting in a drugstore aisle. What makes the printer version different is the lengths the model has been defended, not just through pricing, but through firmware quietly pushed onto machines people already own, engineered to make a choice for them after the sale was already final. You didn't just buy a printer, you bought access to a pipeline, and for a decade, the company reserved the right to decide, after the fact, what was allowed to flow through it. The ink was never really $2 worth of dye. It was the price of admission to a system built, quite literally, to keep you inside it.